By the 1920s, the gray wolf, Canis lupus, had been almost entirely removed from Yellowstone National Park. The last federal predator removals culminated in 1926, leaving a magnificent landscape missing its apex carnivore. Without wolves, elk numbers swelled through the 20th century, and by the 1980s and early 1990s, the northern range reached historically high densities. That change shifted browsing on willow, aspen, and cottonwood, thinning riparian vegetation, reducing beaver numbers, and causing stream channels to widen and erode, simplifying what had been a rich and complex web of life. Conservation groups, including defenders of wildlife, and scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey and Yellowstone argued that restoring wolves could rebuild that ecological complexity. Ranchers in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho worried about livestock losses, and state fish and game agencies insisted on management authority. The gray wolf was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1974, and after years of study, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued a reintroduction rule and final environmental analysis in 1994, setting the stage for the controversial reintroduction in January 1995. Park managers, researchers like Douglas W. Smith and David Meck, and federal lawyers prepared for a collision of science, law, and local livelihoods that captured national attention. In January 1995, and again in early 1996, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service carried out a tightly choreographed reintroduction that moved 31 gray wolves, Canis lupus, from capture sites in Alberta and British Columbia into Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. Operating under the 1994 USFWS reintroduction rule, field crews live-trapped and immobilized the wolves. Veterinarians fitted each animal with radio collars, and biologists crated and transported them under federal escort to holding enclosures on Yellowstone's northern range before opening the pens for release. The logistics were austere and exacting. Veterinary checks, quarantine protocols, telemetry testing, and round-the-clock watch teams helped ensure survival through bitter winter weather. On release days, media vans and researchers crowded park roads. Cameras captured the first moments when, after the crates unlatched, wary animals spilled into the gilded snow, sniffed unfamiliar air, lifted tentative howls, and skirted ridges and rivers in exploration. Subscribe. Maybe it would have warned the elk. Within weeks, observers like Douglas W. Smith and David Meck documented the formation of nascent packs as adults asserted dominance, subadults paired off, and hierarchies crystallized. The sinewy choreography of territory marking, scenting, and cooperative travel. Telemetry and direct observation soon revealed hunting forays. Wolves learning which elk were vulnerable on the northern range and mounting coordinated, efficient chases. Scientists and conservationists greeted the translocation with excitement and immediately mobilized study programs, while national outlets amplified the drama. Across county lines, ranchers in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho voiced anxious alarm about livestock depredation. County commissioners and state fish and game agencies demanded management authority, and heated public meetings foreshadowed the legal and political contests that would intensify as the ecological story unfolded. Within a few seasons after the wolf reintroduction in January 1995 and early 1996, empirical monitoring led by the Yellowstone Wolf Project, established 1995, U.S. Geological Survey teams, and university collaborators began to stitch together a convincing narrative of a trophic cascade across Yellowstone's northern range. Radio telemetry and winter aerial counts showed elk changing their distribution and behavior. They avoided willow and cottonwood-lined riparian corridors along the Lamar River and Soda Butte Creek, shifted feeding to lower-risk plateaus, and spent less time lingering in the narrow valleys where wolves hunted. Vegetation transects, exclosure plots, and repeat photography documented willows and young aspen cohorts growing taller and denser within a few years. Cottonwood recruitment improved at sites that had been overbrowsed. William J. Ripple and Robert L. Beshta's influential early 2000s work crystallized this pattern for a broad audience, and Yellowstone Wolf Project annual reports and peer-reviewed studies provided long-term data through the 2000s that reinforced those findings. Beavers, the engineers of wetlands, returned to formerly denuded streams, rebuilt dams on tributaries, and increased ponded water and habitat complexity. Mesopredator release reversed as coyotes declined in abundance and changed their scavenging behavior after wolves established territories. This shift was documented by direct observation, carcass surveys, and scat analysis. U.S. Geological Survey stream surveys and geomorphic measurements recorded narrowing of some incised channels, reduced bank erosion, and higher water tables in recovering riparian zones. Each dataset telemetry records, vegetation metrics, beaver colony counts, and geomorphology measurements included dates, locations, and methods that made the case repeatable and measurable. As these entwined ecological recoveries accumulated through the late 1990s and 2000s, the public portrayal of wolves shifted from villain to keystone ecosystem engineer, setting the stage for the next act, intensifying public and policy conflicts over their role and management. As willows and aspens began their stately comeback on the northern range, the reintroduction's gilded promise collided with the real-world costs for ranching communities and state agencies. By the late 1990s, verified wolf depredations on cattle and sheep in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho set off a steady stream of complaints, rancher testimony at county commission meetings, and urgent calls for relief. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service faced mounting political pressure, while USDA-APHIS Wildlife Services carried out targeted lethal removals when wolves were confirmed killing livestock. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department pushed for greater management authority and more aggressive on-the-ground control. Conservation groups such as Defenders of Wildlife and the Sierra Club financed compensation payments and non-lethal deterrence, range riders, fladry, and livestock guardian dogs. Defenders' compensation grants helped defuse some disputes by reimbursing verified losses. At the same time, ranching organizations like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association lobbied state legislatures and Congress for expanded control, while environmental lawyers filed suits to preserve federal protections. Telemetry records and Yellowstone Wolf Project mortality reports documented collars cut, suspected poisonings, and unexplained disappearances. Illegal killings, recorded with dates and coordinates in agency incident logs, punctuated the official counts and battered public trust. Scientists argued over methods: causation versus correlation in trophic cascade claims, sample selection, and spatial scale. Peer-reviewed papers and annual reports became ammunition for both sides. Economic strain, a cultural identity tied to open-range ranching, and a visceral fear of depredation hardened positions into a policy deadlock. The resulting impasse, legal challenges, heavy lobbying, conflicting state and federal priorities, and ongoing illegal mortality sent the saga toward a political climax that would decide whether wolves remained a protected keystone or reverted to contested quarry. The turning point came when federal custody of Yellowstone wolves shifted to state control. That transfer, gilded but combustible, crystallized in the late 2000s and erupted in autumn 2009 when the Idaho Department of Fish and Game and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks opened the first state-sanctioned wolf seasons for the Northern Rockies after federal delisting. Agencies issued harvest regulations, public hunters moved into the Lamar Valley and the Gallatin foothills, and packs that had been stable since 1995 began to fragment under a new legal pressure. Radio collar telemetry showed sudden gaps in pack cohesion, alpha pairs were displaced, and Yellowstone Wolf Project field notes documented den abandonment on specified dates in 2009. Politically, the change provoked immediate recrimination. Ranchers and county commissioners hailed state authority as vindication. Conservation groups, including Defenders of Wildlife and the Sierra Club, filed legal challenges and emergency petitions, and USDA APHIS Wildlife Services ramped up lethal removals around verified depredations. The scene became a patchwork of courtroom filings, agency orders, and public hunts that forced a clear choice. Could scientific restoration survive when governance bowed to contested politics? That question set the stage for the wider ecological and social impacts that followed. Yellowstone's wolves, reintroduced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1995 to 96, and later caught up in the tumult of 2009 state delisting, have become a global case study in rewilding and trophic cascade theory. Peer-reviewed studies documented changed elk behavior, measurable riparian recovery, a beaver resurgence, and shifts among mesopredators, advances that pushed both ecological science and on-the-ground restoration forward. But biology alone could not resolve the social conflicts these returns provoked. Livestock depredations, court battles, and state-federal governance fights showed the limits of science-only answers. Future reintroductions will need adaptive management, long-term ecological monitoring, and meaningful community engagement that funds prevention, compensation, and local stewardship. Coexistence requires political will and compromise. It will be uneven, disputed, and long-term. Yellowstone is both a model and a warning. Rewilding can succeed ecologically, but it endures only when human institutions learn to live with the predators they restore.